Welcome to Emavira Audiobooks. This is The Mercy Guest, a Tasmanian noir fiction crime story. A slow, aching story about a lonely widow, the young stranger who arrives to con her, and the secret the widow has been chasing on her own for 11 long years. It's a story about who is really deceiving whom, and about the strange, complicated mercy two women end up offering each other. Let's begin. The D'Entrecasteaux Channel, seen from Ruth Kearney's kitchen window, changed its color by the hour. Silver at dawn, deep green at noon, a bruised violet as the light failed, and Ruth had spent 4 decades as a marine biologist and 11 years as a grieving mother learning every one of its moods. She was 76 now, a widow of 6 years, and the mother of a daughter who had drowned off the rocks below her own house 11 years earlier. The coroner had called it misadventure. Ruth had never quite believed anything so simple. She had been a marine biologist for 4 decades, publishing widely enough that a small, devoted circle of former students and colleagues still wrote to her occasionally for advice she gave freely and missed giving more than she admitted to anyone. She lived alone in the weatherboard house her husband had built with his own hands, on a rise above the water, and she told everyone who asked that she preferred her own company. Privately, in the long silences of a house built for 4 and now holding only 1, she wondered whether she had simply become very good at pretending that solitude didn't weigh on her at all. Bruny Island in winter was not, by any reasonable measure, an easy place to grow old alone. The ferry crossing took 45 minutes each way, weather-dependent, and occasionally cancelled altogether when the channel turned rough, and the nearest hospital sat on the far side of that crossing, a fact that had become, over 6 years of widowhood, both a badge of Ruth's fierce independence and a private anxiety that sharpened a little every year as her own body reminded her in small, unwelcome ways that 76 was not 56, whatever her mind still insisted. She told herself, more than once, that the view alone was reason enough to stay, whatever staying eventually cost her. It was into this careful, guarded quiet that Nell Arden arrived, sent by a support agency in Kingston as a temporary replacement for Ruth's usual home help worker. Ruth answered the door fully intending to send the young woman straight back on the next ferry. She had not expected Nell to notice, within 10 minutes, the pressed specimens of bull kelp framed along the hallway wall, or to ask an informed, curious question about the drying pattern on the largest frond. Ruth had spent 40 years having her life's work politely tolerated at dinner parties. She was not equipped to resist someone who seemed to actually want to know the answer. "You know your bull kelp," Ruth said, watching her closely. "My father used to take me along the coast near Eaglehawk Neck," Nell told her, which was, like nearly everything Nell said professionally, a carefully built truth. She had in fact spent 11 hours the previous week reading everything publicly available about Ruth Kearney, cross-referencing old research papers against family photographs on a Bruny Island community page, quietly mapping exactly which subjects would make this particular lonely woman feel seen for the first time in longer than either of them yet understood. By the end of that first visit, Ruth had extended the placement from a 2-week trial to a full month, telling herself it was purely practical. She did not examine too closely the small, unfamiliar lightness she felt watching Nell's car disappear down the driveway, or the fact that she was already, for the first time in 6 years, looking forward to a Tuesday. Nell had a gift, and she had learned early that a gift left unexamined tends to calcify into either salvation or ruin. Her gift was this. She could become, with unsettling speed, whatever a household was missing. She had discovered it as a child, shuttling between her mother's chaotic house and her grandmother's rigid one, learning to shift her whole self, voice, posture, the rhythm of her sentences, in the length of a single car trip. It was a survival skill first. By her 20s, drifting through underpaid shifts at a nursing home, unable to hold down anything steadier. It had become something else. That was where Diane found her, a well-spoken older woman who watched Nell work a single shift, unannounced, from a visitor's chair, and afterward told her, with unsettling precision, "You don't perform care. You actually become what the person in front of you needs." I know people who'd pay considerably more than a nursing home for exactly that skill, properly directed. Diane described the work as private companion care for wealthy elderly clients whose families, scattered and guilty, would pay well for someone attentive to sit with a parent who'd otherwise be desperately alone. It was not, on its surface, a lie. It was a careful, incomplete truth, the kind Nell would spend 6 years learning to build herself, one placement at a time, until she could no longer clearly locate where the honest version of the job ended and the other one began. "Because you already know how to disappear into what other people need," Diane had told her when Nell asked why she'd been chosen. "I'm simply offering to make sure that gift finally gets you something back, instead of costing you everything the way it has your whole life so far." Diane trained her across that first year in a curriculum with no name and no written materials, delivered through a series of increasingly involved assignments, each one testing Nell's capacity to read a household's missing piece and fill it convincingly. The first had been almost gentle, a widower in Glenorchy who needed, more than anything, someone to listen to 40 years of stories about a wife he'd outlived. Nell did exactly that for 3 months, genuinely moved by some of what she heard, genuinely unsure, by the end, how much of the small gift he'd insisted on leaving her in his will had been earned honestly, and how much engineered. Diane called that one the training wheels, and warned that the real test would come with a client whose actual, unmet needs sat so far beneath the surface that even they didn't know what they were missing until Nell arrived to supply it. Ruth Kearney, Nell understood within the first month, was not a simple assignment. Ruth's missing piece wasn't ordinary loneliness. It was a mother who had spent 11 years unable to finish grieving because some question about her daughter's death sat, unaddressed, beneath every other loss in her life, and that made her, Nell would come to feel, both the easiest client she had ever had, and by far the most dangerous one to keep deceiving. Nell had told no one, not even a therapist she'd briefly seen years earlier, about the moment she'd first understood her childhood adaptability had curdled into something darker, a school essay, in her final year, about a skill that defines you, which she had drafted honestly and then rewritten 3 times, unable to find a version of the truth. "I have learned to become whoever the person in front of me needs me to be." That didn't sound, even to her own 17-year-old ears, less like a strength and more like a warning. In the 3rd week, in what had become an open arrangement, Ruth showed Nell the small back room where her daughter Frances's things had sat almost untouched for 11 years, a room she had never once let her own niece look into. A single bed, a shelf of marine biology texts, and on a hook behind the door, a yellow oilskin raincoat that Ruth touched with a tenderness that made even Nell's practiced warmth waver, briefly, into something real. She wore this out on the boat every time, rain or shine, Ruth said. Superstitious about it, actually, which never made a lick of sense for a scientist, but grief makes fools of even the most rational people. The morning she died, she left it behind. First time in years. I've never decided whether that means something, or whether I simply need everything to mean something, even now. The room's contents told Nell things about Frances that went beyond her earlier research, a stack of letters from a university boyfriend Ruth had never fully approved of, tucked inside a textbook as though hidden for privacy rather than filed for safekeeping, a shelf of field notebooks documenting years of kelp surveys, a corkboard still pinned with photographs from a research trip to Macquarie Island, and a diary, which Nell found herself, against every professional instinct, unable to open. It was the first object in 6 years of this work she chose not to use, and the restraint unsettled her far more than anything the diary might have contained. Cataloging these things, she developed an unwelcome, vivid sense of who Ruth Kearney had actually been, not simply a name attached to a tragedy, but a particular young woman with an exacting mind and a dry humor that reminded Nell, uncomfortably, of nobody so much as herself at that same age, before Diane, before any of it. She mentioned the resemblance to Ruth once, carefully, and watched the older woman's face do something complicated, grief, certainly, but also something that looked disconcertingly like recognition, as though Ruth had been waiting for Nell to notice it herself. Ruth, for her part, had begun keeping her own quiet notes, an old scientist's habit, recording in the margins of a field notebook the small, telling things about Nell, knowledge of Frances that went beyond anything a stranger could plausibly gather, the careful way conversations were steered toward Ruth's finances, always dressed as concern. By the 4th month, Ruth was no longer sure whether she was gathering evidence of a threat or evidence of a young woman worth trying to save. She found she wanted both to be true at once. By the 4th month, the house on Bruny Island had quietly transformed. The photographs of Frances that had lined the hallway for 11 years had been consolidated into the back bedroom, replaced in every room a visitor might actually see by newer photographs. Ruth and Nell at the wildlife sanctuary, Ruth and Nell on the ferry, Ruth and Nell in the garden, standing always in the easy proximity of people who'd known each other far longer than 4 months. The garden itself, neglected since Ruth's husband died, had been coaxed back to life under Nell's patient direction, a genuine skill learned not from any client, but from her grandmother's rigidly ordered house. Ruth found herself working alongside her most afternoons, with calluses she hadn't had in years, and a reason to wake up she hadn't had either. Even Ruth's late husband's old recipe box on the kitchen bench had gained new company, a set of dishes in Nell's careful handwriting, adapted, she explained, from the foods Frances used to love. Information Nell had, in truth, no honest way of ever having gathered, since Frances had been dead 3 years before Nell turned 18. Ruth never thought to check, and would not have wanted to. Neighbors noticed, and said to one another how lucky Ruth was to have found practically a daughter again. The phrase made its way back to Ruth, who repeated it to Nell one evening with unguarded pleasure, and Nell absorbed it with her own practiced warmth, while privately, lying awake that night, she felt something she had not expected to feel this deep into an assignment, the beginning of real, unmanufactured guilt. She rang Diane's usual contact that week to report progress in the organization's coded language, and found she could not deliver the next scripted step, the introduction of a solicitor, the first conversation about protecting Ruth's interests that would begin quietly redirecting her assets. She told them she needed another month. It was not strictly a lie. It was also, she understood even as she said it, the first deliberate act of sabotage she had ever committed against an assignment, and her hands were shaking by the time she hung up. Meanwhile, in Melbourne, Ruth's niece Claire, who had left Tasmania 9 years earlier, partly for a design career the island could never have supported, and partly, if she was honest with herself on the rare nights she allowed it, because watching her aunt's grief up close had become more than she could carry alongside her own share of it, had begun noticing small, worrying shifts in her aunt's fortnightly phone calls. A new lightness in Ruth's voice that Claire first mistook for happiness, until Ruth mentioned, almost offhand, that she'd updated her emergency contact to Nell, since it's silly to make you the first call from so far away. Claire's mother, Ruth's sister, mentioned uneasily that quite a few of Frances's old photographs had come down from the hallway. A colleague whose own grandmother had been targeted by a similar, cruder scam told Claire bluntly, "You need to go and see her in person." Phone calls are exactly what people like this rely on families not having time to interrupt. Claire booked a flight without telling Ruth and found, walking into the house, a hallway that no longer held a single photograph of the cousin she'd grown up idolizing, replaced by a smiling stranger she'd never met. Ruth greeted her warmly, and Nell was, by any measure of a single afternoon, exactly as pleasant and attentive as every report suggested, asking Claire thoughtful questions, deferring naturally to Ruth's memories. It was only that evening, watching Nell gently correct Ruth's account of a doctor's appointment with quiet, absolute certainty, and watching Ruth simply absorb the correction without argument, that Claire felt the first real chill of the visit. Not because the correction was wrong, because of how completely a woman who'd spent her whole life arguing with far better qualified scientists had simply deferred to it. Around the same time, Dr. Imogen Shaw, Ruth's GP for 11 years, who had watched her present at every appointment with the particular controlled stoicism of a woman determined never to let her grief become a burden on anyone's professional time, found herself unsettled by Ruth's 6-month checkup, the first Nell had insisted on attending, just to help carry things and take notes, since Ruth's memory for the medical details isn't what it used to be. When Imogen asked about Ruth's blood pressure and sleep, it was Nell who answered first, gently noting that Ruth had been a bit confused in the evenings, repeating stories, forgetting where she'd put things, offering, with a small notebook already open on her lap, to share the notes she'd been keeping, since it was easy for small changes to slip past a checkup that only happened every 6 months. Imogen had trained early at a large mainland hospital's geriatric ward and carried forward a particular vigilance for the subtle, easily overlooked signs of elder financial and psychological abuse, a vigilance that had occasionally strained her relationships with well-meaning families who resented the implication that their care might warrant scrutiny. She found herself torn. A devoted carer noticing and documenting small cognitive changes was exactly the kind of engaged support she wished more of her elderly patients had. And yet something about the thoroughness of Nell's concern, its careful positioning of Ruth as a slightly less reliable narrator of her own life, nagged at a part of her professional instinct she had learned, over 2 decades, not to dismiss even when she couldn't justify it. She adjusted Ruth's medication, booked an early follow-up rather than the standard 6 months, and made a brief, unusual note in the file flagging the new carer's prominent role, a small act of caution that would later prove to be one of the only pieces of documentary evidence anyone had troubled to record. What neither Nell nor Dr. Shaw yet understood, what Ruth herself might not have fully admitted even to her own reflection, was that Ruth had spent 11 years carrying a private, unresolved conviction that Frances's death had not been the simple accident the coroner recorded. And some part of her, watching this unusually perceptive young woman settle into her house with startling speed, had begun to wonder whether Nell's arrival was less coincidence than reckoning. Ruth had never told anyone, not Claire, not her sister, not even Imogen across 11 years of appointments, about a conversation with Frances 3 days before her death. Frances had met, through her marine research, a wealthy older visitor to the island whose attention she'd found flattering, and then, increasingly unsettling, something closer to proprietary than admiring. Ruth had told her daughter not to be dramatic, that the man was a respected community benefactor. 3 days later, Frances was dead on the rocks below the house, and the visitor had left the island within the week, his donation to the research station quietly withdrawn. Ruth had spent 11 years unable to decide whether her dismissiveness was an ordinary, forgivable failure or something closer to complicity in a truth she'd never let herself investigate. Frances had been 29, 3 years into research on the channel's warming kelp forests, exacting and occasionally difficult in exactly the ways her mother had been. Impatient with sloppy methodology, unwilling to let a comfortable but inaccurate conclusion stand simply because it was convenient, a trait that earned her both fierce respect and, from some colleagues, quiet resentment. She was, by every account, a woman who respected the coastline too much to ever be careless on it, which was precisely what made her death by a careless fall so hard for Ruth to accept. Frances had walked that stretch 1,000 times, in every weather the island produced, with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew exactly what the rocks could and couldn't forgive. Ruth had sat, in the raw first year, in the public gallery of the Coronial Inquiry with a folder of questions she never worked up the courage to ask aloud, and watched the inquiry conclude, briskly and not unkindly, that a young scientist had slipped on wet rocks during a routine evening walk, an unremarkable tragedy of exactly the kind that stretch of coastline produced with grim regularity. It was Imogen, in fact, 18 months before Nell's arrival, who had unknowingly planted the seed, mentioning in passing during a routine appointment that she'd once treated another patient who described a troubling interaction with a wealthy benefactor at the same research station. The two women, over the incidental intimacy of a decade of medical appointments, finally pieced the coincidence together out loud, and it gave Ruth the first genuine foothold she'd had in a decade, a name, Julian Renshaw. Ruth went home that evening and sat with the name a long time before writing it down, some old, careful scientific instinct warning her against moving too quickly on a single, second-hand data point. It took a further 6 months of patient, methodical cross-referencing, old newspaper archives, research station donor records requested under Freedom of Information provisions, a handful of increasingly specific phone calls to former colleagues, before she felt confident enough in the pattern to begin the formal correspondence that would eventually fill a folder in her filing cabinet, locked beside her old research grant applications, a small, deliberate irony she allowed herself to appreciate only rarely, on the nights when the whole undertaking felt less like justice and more like an old woman's stubborn refusal to let a decade-old grief finally rest. She never doubted the effort was worth making. She had spent a career teaching graduate students that the absence of easy proof was never, on its own, sufficient reason to stop asking a question worth asking, and she was not about to abandon that principle now, in the one investigation of her life that mattered to her more than any published paper ever had. Not because it could bring Frances back, which nothing ever could, but because it might finally let her stop wondering at 3 every morning for the rest of whatever years she had left, whether her own last piece of motherly advice had been the thing that killed her daughter. She kept the investigation compartmentalized, sharing pieces of the truth with different people and the whole picture with no one, a habit of careful secrecy that would, in the end, make her own account of events extraordinarily difficult for anyone to reconstruct once her disappearance made the whole private investigation suddenly, urgently relevant. She had already begun, in the months before Nell arrived, requesting old visitor logs from the research station and quietly reconstructing exactly who had been on the island in the weeks around her daughter's death. She had not expected, in the middle of that private hunt, a young support worker to arrive who seemed to understand, with unsettling intuition, exactly which of Frances's belongings mattered and exactly which questions Ruth herself had never answered. She had never remarried, never seriously considered it, telling friends who raised the subject that she had already used up whatever capacity she'd once had for that kind of vulnerability, first on her husband and then, more completely, on her daughter. It was an armor worn so long it had become invisible even to Ruth herself, and it was precisely that armor Nell's careful attention had begun, however manipulatively, to crack open, one shared afternoon in the garden, one carefully chosen question about kelp at a time, until a woman who had spent a decade convinced she needed nothing from anyone found herself, almost without noticing the shift, genuinely listening for the sound of a car in her driveway. In the 8th month of the placement, during a stretch of severe autumn weather, Ruth disappeared. Nell's account was that Ruth had gone walking toward the cliffs, distressed after a phone call from Claire, and had simply not returned. Search teams combed the coastline for 3 days in weather that made the search itself dangerous, and found no body. Only a single boot print near the cliff edge that forensic examiners could never conclusively match to Ruth's own footwear. The whole island seemed to absorb the search into its collective grief, volunteers arriving from every corner of Bruny to walk the coastline, in weather that kept the Coast Guard's own vessels tied up in harbor, the local produce stand transformed into an impromptu coordination center stacked with thermoses of tea nobody had time to drink. Nell walked the coastline with the volunteers every day, refusing every suggestion she rest, and it was this visible, apparently inexhaustible distress that made her, to nearly everyone, the last person anyone would have suspected of anything but genuine love for a woman she'd come to treat as family. Only Constable Freya Cole, newly arrived on the case with an outsider's detachment, found herself watching that grief with an uncomfortable clinical attentiveness. Nothing about it looked performed, and yet something about the rehearsed precision of Nell's account of the missing afternoon, repeated identically each time she was asked, nagged at her. Claire flew in from Melbourne on the first available flight, arriving to a scene of genuine, community-wide distress, search parties, concerned neighbors, a local newspaper already running a front-page story about the beloved retired marine biologist, missing in the storm. In the chaos of those first days, she found herself unable to separate her own grief and fear from a small, persistent, guilty suspicion she couldn't silence, that Nell's account of the missing afternoon, delivered with every appearance of genuine distress, contained gaps a less overwhelmed version of herself might have pressed on immediately. It was in her aunt's bank records, requested as police began ruling out foul play, that she found the detail that crystallized her unease. 3 weeks before vanishing, Ruth had changed her enduring power of attorney, her medical decision-making authority, and the beneficiary details on 2 investment accounts, all in Nell Arden's favor, through a solicitor Claire had never heard mentioned before. "She never told me any of this," Claire told Freya. "And Ruth told me everything, even the boring things." Freya Cole had transferred to Tasmania 18 months earlier from a mainland regional posting, drawn by a promotion that had, in practice, meant considerably more solitary responsibility than she'd anticipated for an officer only 4 years into her career. Only 4 years into that career and newly responsible for a wide, ferry-dependent posting, she listened carefully, aware that grief and suspicion could equally distort a witness. "I'm not going to tell you your aunt's judgment failed her," she said. "In my experience, elderly people targeted this way are rarely foolish. They're lonely, which is a very different thing. I want you to help me build a complete picture, because right now I have a missing woman, a highly unusual pattern of financial changes, and a carer whose account of yesterday afternoon has 3 details that don't line up with what the search teams found on the ground." Dr. Imogen Shaw, watching the search unfold on the local news, thought often of that 6-month checkup and the note she'd made in Ruth's file. She raised the matter with Freya directly, offering her clinical notes and a candid account of her own unease. "I keep thinking I should have insisted on seeing her alone," she said. "It's standard practice, in principle, though remarkably easy to let slide when the carer accompanying a patient seems so plainly devoted. I let politeness override protocol, Constable, and I don't know yet what that cost." "From what we can tell so far, Doctor," Freya told her, more gently than her training strictly required, "it may not have cost anything at all." Ruth Kearney, it turns out, appears to have been considerably more aware of her own situation than any of us gave her credit for. It was Freya, working through Ruth's phone records, who found the voice memos, 17 of them, recorded quietly over the preceding 2 months, apparently a private journal Ruth had never mentioned to anyone. The early ones were unremarkable garden plans, tide patterns. The later ones, from the final 3 weeks, made Freya sit bolt upright at her desk. Nell asked me again today why I've never fully forgiven myself about Frances, Ruth's voice said, in one recording. I don't know how she knows there's something to forgive myself for. I've never told anyone that, not properly. I find myself wondering whether she simply reads people the way I used to read a current, noticing what's moving beneath the surface before anyone else thinks to look. And then, most disturbing of all, a recording from 4 days before her disappearance, her voice steady, clear, entirely lucid. None of the confusion Nell had described to Dr. Shaw. I want this recorded properly, in case anything happens and someone eventually thinks to look. I am not confused. I have not been confused in months, whatever anyone else has been told. I am afraid, but I want to be precise about who I am afraid of, because I do not think it is who anyone would assume. I am afraid of Claire finding out what I've done with the accounts before I've had the chance to explain it myself. I am not afraid of Nell. I think, God help me, I may finally be less afraid of anything than I have been in 11 years. Freya played that recording for Claire in the community hall the investigation had taken over, and watched her face move through disbelief into something like a fresh, complicated grief entirely apart from fear. She sounds so calm, Claire said. I've been picturing her terrified. And instead, she sounds like she's been running her own investigation this whole time. It means your aunt is considerably more capable than either of us gave her credit for, Freya said. It tells me we need to stop assuming Ruth Kearney was a passive victim in whatever's been happening in that house, and start asking what she might have been doing on purpose. Nell Arden was found 4 days later, not fleeing the island, as investigators had begun to fear, but sitting in her car in the ferry terminal car park, engine off, having apparently sat there, according to a terminal worker's account, most of a full day without ever boarding a ferry in either direction. She did not resist when Freya approached the vehicle and gave, in the hours of interview that followed, an account that unsettled the investigation more than a straightforward confession of murder would have, because it was neither a confession nor a denial, but something caught uneasily between the two. I didn't hurt her, Nell said, over and over, her composure cracking. Whatever else I've done, the accounts, the power of attorney, I know how it looks. I did not hurt Ruth Kearney. I couldn't have. Somewhere in the last 8 months, I stopped being able to see her as a job, and I don't know when that happened, and everything I was trained to do requires that it never happen. Where is she, Ms. Arden? I don't know. Her voice broke properly. She told me she needed to walk alone, to think, and I let her go because she'd been walking alone for weeks by then. When she wasn't back after 2 hours, I called it in exactly the way I said. I've spent 4 days trying to find the moment I should have done something differently, and I cannot find it, and I don't know if that means I'm innocent or simply very good at telling myself comforting stories. Pressed on the financial changes, Nell admitted the solicitor had been arranged by Diane's organization, dressed up as standard protection against other, less scrupulous predators. I believed that for years, she said, the way you believe things you badly need to be true, because the alternative makes you into someone you can't stand to look at. I started slowing everything down once I understood what was actually happening with Ruth. I never signed the final transfer documents Diane's people kept pushing. I told them the timeline needed to change, when the truth was I wasn't ready, because somewhere in those 8 months she'd stopped being an assignment and started being the closest thing to family I'd had since I was a child. That's a very convenient story for someone facing serious charges. I know how it sounds. I've spent 6 years building a career out of convenient stories, Constable. I'm telling you anyway because it happens to be true, and because if something has actually happened to Ruth, I'd rather you hear the true version from me now. Freya let the silence stretch a long moment before asking the question she had been building toward for the better part of the interview. Why? If Nell had genuinely stopped believing in what she was doing, she hadn't simply walked away, gone to the police herself, got out before any of it reached the point of a missing woman and an interview room. Nell's laugh, when it came, held no humor at all. Because I didn't know how to be anyone else. I've spent my entire adult life becoming whatever a room needed. I didn't know how to simply be a person with my own name, uncomplicated by anyone else's absence. I suspect that's rather the point of everything Diane built. People shaped this way don't actually know how to walk away, even when we want to. There's nothing solid enough underneath the performance to walk toward instead. While Nell was being questioned, Claire was working through her aunt's private files and finally pieced together what Ruth had been quietly hunting. Julian Renshaw, the wealthy visitor from 11 years earlier, had funded a marine conservation grant that brought him to the island during the exact period of Frances's death, and had been seen arguing with her on the research station jetty the very morning she died, a detail mentioned to the original inquiry and never pursued. Claire spent 3 full days working through the folder Ruth had assembled and found herself, by the end of it, in a state of quiet, retrospective horror at how methodically and how alone her aunt had pursued this. Years of patient inquiry conducted entirely without family support, entirely without the comfort of sharing the burden with a single other person, until a young stranger arrived who seemed, however manipulatively at first, willing to actually listen. Claire tracked down the retired colleague who'd first mentioned the jetty argument, Patricia Voss, who told Freya she had spent a decade regretting not pressing harder when the original coroner's office seemed uninterested in pursuing it. You reach a certain age and you assume the professionals know better than you do, she said, and then you spend 11 years wondering whether that assumption cost a young woman's family the truth. I'm very glad someone has finally thought to ask me again, however late. Claire found, too, that Ruth's investigation had gone further than anyone in the family had realized. A formal request to Tasmania police to reopen the original coronial file, submitted 6 weeks before her disappearance and still, according to the acknowledgement letter in the folder, awaiting formal review, a series of increasingly pointed letters to Julian Renshaw himself. The most recent dated just 8 days before Ruth vanished, requesting a meeting to discuss matters concerning my daughter that I believe you understand better than the coronial record currently reflects. Freya spent a long night reading the entire folder a second time before making any calls, aware she was standing at the edge of a case considerably larger than a missing 76-year-old woman, and aware, too, how easily a decade-old, informally reopened suspicion could collapse under the weight of insufficient evidence if she moved too quickly or too publicly. She rang her sergeant first, laying out the full picture with the same careful thoroughness Ruth herself had brought to the original research and received, to her considerable relief, immediate support for pursuing the connection formally. Following the thread further, she learned Renshaw had died 18 months earlier, his estate now in the hands of a nephew who had, by an unsettling coincidence, engaged the same shadowy estate administration practice that a separate statewide investigation, led by Detective Callum Frost, was already circling in connection with a wider network of frauds against elderly Tasmanians. Frost's own investigation, deep into the financial records of another notorious Tasmanian fraud case, had already begun noticing connections between seemingly unrelated estates and beneficiaries that suggested something coordinated. It's probably nothing, he told Freya on their first call, And I've said that about at least 4 connections in the last year that turned out to be very much something. Send me everything you have, Constable, and let's find out together which kind this one is. Diane's operation, it was becoming clear, was only one small branch of something much larger. It was in the middle of all this, search teams still combing the coast, the DPP's office beginning to weigh charges against Nell, that a local fisherman named Barry Dwyer, checking his craypots along the island's remote southern coast, noticed smoke curling from the chimney of a long-empty fishing shack that had belonged, decades earlier, to Ruth's husband's family. The shack had sat empty for the better part of a decade, and Barry radioed the smoke in more from curiosity than expectation. Freya insisted on being part of the small team that motored around the point to check, over the objection of a senior officer who thought the report too flimsy to justify diverting resources from the main search grid. She was first through the shack's weathered door and found Ruth Kearney sitting upright by a small fire, wrapped in a blanket that had clearly been there for years, cold, dehydrated, and entirely, astonishingly lucid. She had walked there herself, deliberately, along a stretch of coastline she knew better than anyone alive, choosing her route specifically to leave that single misleading boot print near the cliffs. I let Nell believe what she needed to believe, Ruth told Freya later, sitting up in a Hobart hospital bed with Claire gripping her hand. About the confusion, about needing help managing my affairs. I am considerably sharper than I let either of them see. Nell, or that solicitor she found me, who I'm fairly confident was never quite what he claimed either. I wanted to see how far the current would carry things before deciding whether I needed to swim against it. And I needed somewhere quiet to finish what I'd started about Francis, somewhere nobody, out of concern for my safety, could interrupt me. You put your whole community through 11 days of believing you were dead, Mrs. Kearney. I know. Her voice caught, the first real crack in her composure since she'd been found. That part one did not plan well, and I am deeply sorry for it, particularly to Claire. I intended to be gone 3 or 4 days, with supplies I'd laden myself over the preceding month. The weather turned, and I am 76, not immortal, whatever I like to tell myself. She squeezed Claire's hand. I have spent 11 years since Francis died feeling like a woman things simply happened to. For 8 months, for the first time since your cousin died, I decided to be a woman things happened because of instead. I am not certain it was wise. I am fairly certain it was necessary, for reasons I don't know that I can fully explain even to myself. Freya, standing quietly at the foot of the hospital bed through most of the exchange, found herself thinking about how rarely, in her 4 years of policing, victims were permitted this kind of complicated, self-directed agency, how thoroughly the language of investigation tended to flatten people into either victims or suspects, with little room left for the messier truth that most people, most of the time, occupied some shifting position between the two. She made a note that evening to raise the observation with her sergeant, uncertain whether it belonged in a formal case file, but certain it belonged somewhere in how she thought about the job going forward. The formal case against Nell Arden, once Ruth's account, and the full financial records were laid out before the Director of Public Prosecutions, proved considerably more complicated to resolve than any straightforward charge of fraud or elder abuse. Nell had, undeniably, cultivated a relationship with a vulnerable elderly woman under false professional pretenses and had redirected significant financial authority toward herself through means that would not survive close ethical scrutiny, however technically consensual Ruth's own signatures made them appear. She had, by her own admission, been recruited and trained specifically for this purpose by an organization whose reach investigators were only beginning to properly map. But Ruth herself, adamant and entirely lucid, refused to be characterized as a victim of the most serious charges, insisting she had known, for months, far more about Nell's true purposes than Nell had ever suspected, and had made her own fully informed choices about how much trust to extend in return for what she called, without irony, the most honest companionship I've had in 11 years. However dishonestly it began. The Director of Public Prosecutions ultimately proceeded on fraud and breach of trust, while declining the more serious charges, a decision Freya found professionally maddening even as she understood it. "I don't know that I've ever worked a case," she told a colleague, with a complainant less interested in being treated as a victim. Word of the case spread well beyond Bruny Island itself, picked up by mainland outlets already primed, after the previous year's coverage of the notorious Maravos trial, to recognize the pattern a lonely elderly Tasmanian and a suspiciously attentive young companion now seemed to represent. Claire found the attention exhausting and in its own way clarifying, forced by journalists' persistent questions to say out loud, repeatedly, exactly what she believed had happened and what she thought should happen next. She took extended leave from her Melbourne design firm, uncertain when or whether she'd return full-time, unable any longer to reconcile her old life with the complicated new closeness that had grown between herself and her aunt. Furious at Nell for the deception, for the 11 days of terror, and simultaneously unable to dismiss her aunt's insistence that something real had passed between the two women, Claire arrived, in the end, at an uneasy peace. "I don't think Nell should walk away without consequence," she told Freya. "But I've also watched my aunt, for the first time in 11 years, choose her own story instead of having one imposed on her. I'm not sure I have the right to take that away from her." The trial ran 8 days and ended in a verdict that satisfied almost no one. Nell convicted of fraud and breach of trust, but acquitted of exploitation and undue influence, on the strength of Ruth's own unwavering testimony. She received 18 months, suspended after 6, the judge citing genuinely unusual mitigating circumstances, including credible evidence the defendant had begun actively working against her own training's intended outcome well before her actions came to police attention. Ruth attended every day of the trial, and on the 4th day gave testimony courtroom observers called the strangest of the entire proceeding, an alleged victim spending the better part of an hour arguing against her own characterization as one. "I would like the record to reflect," she told the court, "that I am a retired scientist who spent 4 decades studying systems considerably more complex than a single young woman's motivations, and I am entirely capable of assessing when I am being deceived and choosing, with full awareness, to continue extending trust regardless, for reasons that were my own to weigh." The judge let the answer stand in full, noting the witness's evident competence spoke for itself. The 6-month custodial portion of Nell's sentence was served at the state's only women's prison, and Ruth, against the advice of nearly everyone in her life, including her own solicitor, applied for and was eventually granted a single supervised visit 2 months into the sentence, an encounter neither woman ever described in full detail to anyone else afterward, though Ruth emerged from it, according to Claire's own observation, looking lighter than she had at any point since the 11 days of her disappearance. Nell wrote to Ruth once from prison, a letter Ruth read alone on her own porch before deciding, some weeks later, to write back. She never told Claire the full contents of either letter, saying only that some conversations belonged to the people having them, and that she had decided, at 76, she had earned the right to keep at least one part of her complicated, unfinished grief entirely to herself. Nell, for her part, agreed to a formal cooperation agreement with Frost's statewide task force, sitting for extensive interviews describing everything she could remember of her own recruitment and training, the TAFE campus approach, the graduated assignments, the psychological profiling Diane had taught her to perform on every new client within the first fortnight of any placement. It proved, over the following 2 years, some of the most detailed first-hand testimony the task force had yet obtained about the actual mechanics of Diane's operation, and it helped investigators begin identifying other operatives trained through the same method in districts no prior case had touched. Meanwhile, Detective Callum Frost's task force moved on Julian Renshaw's estate. His nephew's solicitors, once shown the mounting evidence connecting his late uncle to Frances Kearney's death and to the wider network Frost was dismantling, advised him in the strongest possible terms to settle quickly and quietly rather than risk a public trial that would expose considerably more about his late uncle's affairs than the family was prepared to have aired. Ruth's own solicitor, engaged this time through channels thoroughly vetted and entirely independent of anyone connected to Diane's network, negotiated a settlement that took the better part of a year to finalize, delayed repeatedly by the nephew's evident hope that Ruth's advancing age and the passage of time might erode her resolve. It did not. Ruth attended every mediation session in person, traveling to Hobart by ferry each time, regardless of weather, and told Claire afterward she had found the whole drawn-out process, however exhausting, considerably more satisfying than she'd expected, a decade of silence finally, tediously, being converted into something resembling accountability. The reopened coronial inquiry into Frances's death concluded, 11 years almost to the week after she'd walked out of the house for the last time, with an amended finding: death consistent with a fall, but circumstances, including an unresolved altercation with a person of interest in the hours before her death, sufficient to strike the word misadventure from the record in favor of an open finding. Not the definitive answer Ruth had spent 11 years hoping for, but enough, she told Claire, to finally feel her daughter's death had been taken seriously by someone other than her own grieving mother. She wept over the news privately for most of an afternoon before she could bring herself to tell anyone else at all. Ruth used the settlement money to establish a small scholarship in Frances's name at the research station where her daughter had worked, ensuring that one young researcher each year would spend a season studying the kelp forests Frances had loved. The fund grew, in the years that followed, beyond what Ruth had initially envisioned, as word of Frances's story spread through the small, tightly connected community of Tasmanian marine researchers, several of whom contributed funding of their own once they learned the full history behind it. Ruth attended the announcement ceremony every year her health allowed, standing in the same modest hall where Frances had once presented her own early findings to a room of considerably less attentive colleagues, telling the young researchers each time some version of the same message, that curiosity and stubbornness, properly combined, could outlast almost anything a person tried to bury, however many years it eventually took to surface, and that the questions worth asking were rarely the comfortable ones. Claire visited more often after that, no longer needing fortnightly phone calls to reassure herself her aunt was safe, and found, on her visits, a woman changed in ways she was still learning to understand, quieter in some respects, considerably more guarded about who she let into the house, but also, unmistakably, lighter than she had been in the 11 years before Nell Arden first knocked on her door. One quiet evening on the porch, months after the trial, Ruth and Claire turned the whole strange story over one more time. "I think," Claire said finally, "that it doesn't have to be one thing or the other. I think a person can be trained into real harm and still, somewhere in the middle of doing it, become someone capable of choosing differently. I don't think that makes the harm smaller. I think it just means people are more complicated than the categories we keep trying to sort them into." Ruth considered that, watching the last light fade over the channel. "Your cousin used to say something similar about the creatures she studied, that the categories humans invent are always more useful to the humans doing the sorting than they are accurate about anything actually alive out there in the water." She smiled, the expression carrying 11 years of grief made suddenly, unexpectedly lighter. I think I've decided that Nell Arden is considerably more like something alive in that water than like any of the tidy categories the law tried to force her into. I don't know if that helps you decide anything, Claire. It's simply where I've landed after everything. Ruth kept the raincoat, in the end, moved it from the back bedroom to a hook by the front door, where she could see it every time she left the house, no longer a relic sealed away, but an ordinary part of her daily life, worn now on her own walks along the coastline she refused, even after everything, to stop loving. I spent a decade guarding Frances's things like a museum exhibit, she told Claire, standing at the kitchen window with the same view Nell had once admired on her very first visit. I think some part of me believed that if I kept everything exactly as she left it, I was keeping some part of her alive too. It took a stranger walking into my life for entirely dishonest reasons to teach me that the opposite was true. She's more alive to me now, somehow, since I let someone else finally ask about her, touch her things, wear her coat, and be curious about who she actually was, than she ever was in 11 years of keeping the door shut. She watched a small boat cross the channel far below, its wake catching the last of the light. I don't recommend anyone else learn that lesson the way I did, but I am not sorry to have learned it, all the same, and I don't imagine I'll ever be sorry again. And there we leave Ruth Kearney, standing at her kitchen window above the channel, a mother's long question finally answered, a strange debt finally paid in a currency nobody could have predicted. Thank you so much for listening to the Mercy Guest until then. Take care, and thank you for spending this hour with us.